This time I decided to analyze the track Higher by London Grammar and Camelphat. This is a huge track. It's labeled on Beatport as melodic house, but it borrows from a lot of different genres. It reminds me a lot of some of the progressive house and trance I used to spin back in the early 2000s when I started DJing. So it's got a very nostalgic feel for me, and I really like that. Particularly what we will be focusing on is breaking down the bass sound that comes in the first drop and the second drop, and we'll focus on the chord sound or the pad sound that you hear in the second drop of the song. This is a nice, bright, kind of detuned super saw sound, and it was a lot of fun to pick apart and try to recreate this one. So this will be a two-part video series. We'll start with the bass and then use the underlying notes from the bass as a foundation for the chords, and then we'll build the pad sound with the chords in the second video. We're going to get pretty in-depth. We'll be using Anna 2, so stick around and let's get right to it. All right, so let's kick things off by tackling this bass sound. This is going to come in, if you're listening to the extended mix like I have here, this comes in right around the 30-second mark. On the original mix of the song, I think it comes in right in the first drop, which is going to be probably around a similar spot. It might be a little bit earlier, but this is what we're listening for right here. So this big brassy bass sound. And the bass line's fairly simple. It's 6 notes, so you got the first 3 notes repeating twice during the first 8 bars, and then the second 3 notes repeating twice during the second 8 bars, creating a full 16-bar motif here. If you want to pause the video and see the notes here, the track, when I was searching around online, it says it's in, I think, E minor, but through analyzing the chords and everything like that, I determined it was A mixolydian. The bass line is going to be the same. I mean, you'll see the notes here are all in A mixolydian. I'm using Ableton's scale feature over here. But if you switch it to E minor, you'll see the bass notes are actually all going to fall in line. They're still going to be in the, they're all going to be highlighted in that scale. But the chords get a little bit more complex, so I'm going to leave it in A mixolydian. But anyway, we're just going from a B to an A to an E twice. You can see rhythmically how that's happening. And then a G to an A down to an E again. And now pay attention also to the velocities. This is going to be important when we start crafting the sound here, but you see the first note has a slightly lower velocity. My velocity here is 100. The second note, I've cranked the velocity all the way up to 127. The third note, the velocity is a little bit lower, 93. And I've kept that kind of same velocity pattern for all 3 groups of notes here. As you can see, 100, 127, around 90-ish, or 89 for that one. And like I said, this will come into play when we start building the sound. So let's get into Anna 2. And we'll start from our initialized patch. And let's solo the Anna 2 track. Okay, so we will need a saw wave, although the default kind of digital saw wave isn't really what I'm looking for here. I want something a little more rounded that has a little bit more weight to it. So I'm going to go with the Saw MS, which is, I believe, from a Korg MS-20. And you can see here, it's slightly different because the upward ramps here are slightly rounded. And when you're looking at waveforms, kind of a tip here, when you're looking at waveforms, going through different wavetables and oscillators and things like that, if you notice something that's a bit more rounded and a little bit more almost sine wave-like or sinusoidal, that's generally going to have a little bit more low-end weight to it, rather than something like, say, this, which is a fairly thin sound. It doesn't really have much of a sine wavy shape to it. And its amplitude doesn't really fully touch the top or bottom. Well, I guess at the beginning here, it kind of touches the bottom of the amplitude window. But you can see here, this is nice and rounded and kind of siney on the edges. So that's going to give a little more weight to the sound. So we'll start here by manipulating our oscillator settings. We actually want to increase the voice count to 2, and we'll only need 1 oscillator for this. We won't need to use oscillators 2 or 3, but we are going to use 2 voices. We do want to have it detuned, but not so much. We can reduce the detune down to about 25% or so. And then we don't want this to be stereo at all. The sound is rather dry and rather thin in the reference, so we're going to bring this width control right down. If that's up, that's going to detune. Well, this is going to detune, but it's going to spread those detuned voices out in the stereo field, and we don't really want that for the bass. So that's going to give us a bit of a modulated analog character to the sound. We can also turn the volume up here. We got quite a bit of headroom. Let me also make sure my clip here is looping in the arrangement, just so we can kind of keep it playing as needed. Hit spacebar again, get that going. Okay, so let's turn the volume up. Kind to work into our headroom here. We don't want it to clip, but we can turn it up a decent amount here. We'll start there. If we need to turn it up more, we can. And then we're going to get down to the filter, and this is really where a lot of the magic is going to happen here. This is where it's going to start to take this brassy shape. So let's use one of our low-pass filter types. I kind of went through all of these, and I found that the Oberheim low-pass tends to sound best for what we're trying to do here. I'm going to bypass any master filter controls here, so I like to turn this cutoff all the way down, this cutoff 1-2 dial all the way down, and we'll just focus on using this cutoff. We're going to set this to about maybe like 40 hertz, somewhere in there. And right now, if we play it, let's hit spacebar again. Did I hit spacebar? Yeah, we don't really hear anything because we're cutting so many of the frequencies out. All we're left with is frequencies below 40 hertz, which we can barely hear. So we need to start modulating the filter cutoff, and we're going to do this with our filter envelope over here. So a couple of things we're going to do. First off, I think I can leave the release time relatively slow here. Maybe not that slow. Let's go about 4.5 seconds. Maybe a little more than that. And then the decay time, I'm actually going to decrease the decay time a little bit, maybe up to about 4 seconds. Somewhere in there should be fine. And then we're going to turn this envelope dial up. Now, if you're not familiar with this, if we turn this up, this is essentially modulation amount from this filter envelope to the filter cutoff. So the more we turn this up to the right, the more we're telling this filter envelope to take our cutoff dial and increase it during the attack time. Because my sustain level's all the way down, it's going to drop the filter cutoff back down to that level during the decay time. So we're going to get a fast rise and a slow fall. You can kind of hear that happening now. And we probably don't need this much on the modulation amount here, but let's dial this in somewhere between 30 and 40%. And let's start to turn the resonance up too. This is going to make it sound a little bit more vocal. The more I turn this up, it almost sounds like a cat or like a wow or something like that. So we don't want too much of that, but we do want some of that character in the sound. And this is where it starts to take this sort of brassy shape. Now let's go over to our amp envelope over here. I think I want to increase the release time maybe just a little bit here. So as we let go of notes, we get a little bit of a tail to the note. And since we're increasing the release, it wouldn't hurt to also go down here to our voicing settings. Let's turn the monophonic voicing on. So we can only hear one note at a time. So some of those notes are pretty long, and the end of one MIDI note gets pretty close to the beginning of the next one. So we won't want any overlap, especially with these low frequency pitches here. The sound is already almost there. There's just a few more things we want to do here. Let's go into our effects section. Let's turn on the first effect here, and let's actually change it from a chorus. I want to use a limiter. So we'll go to the dynamic effects here. We'll go to the limiter. And we can leave the soft clipping off, but let's reduce the thresholds down to about maybe like -3. And we're going to turn the dry wet all the way up. I think the input and output we can leave. And this is just going to be to start to control the volume as we start to increase the velocity sensitivity of the sound. So let's move on to that next. So let's start by going to our amp envelope, and let's turn the velocity sensitivity up a little bit here. The more we turn this up from 0, here it's at 0% when we're at 12 o'clock. The more I turn this up, the more it means that higher velocities will increase the volume and lower velocities will decrease the volume. So a little bit of this is going to go a long way here. I'll set this to about 18%. That's probably fine, 18, 19%. And then we're going to start to turn up the velocity sensitivity here on the filter envelope. Now, again, this means that higher velocities, if I turn it up to the right and I give it a positive value, higher velocities will tell this filter envelope to open the cutoff more. Lower velocities will tell it not to open quite as much. So this is where, if you remember the velocities in our MIDI clip, let's take a quick look at that again. I have higher velocities on those middle notes, on those A notes. Those are going to just pop out a little bit more as the filter cutoff opens up a bit more. We can really drive that effect up. So you can really hear it on that A note. Kind of gets a little bit brighter as it opens up. We'll hear it one more time here. I'll shut up. Right, so we want a little bit of that movement in the sound, not too much. So set this to about 40% maybe. And now let's check this with the drums. I've got a looped section of the drums here, or at least I had a looped section of the drums. Let's take a bit from the end of the song here. Let's maybe take this section because we don't have that white noise thing going crazy. Yeah, right here. So I'm going to copy this, and then we'll just paste it over here. And then we'll duplicate that a couple of times just so we can hear it in context. So we'll have our bass going with some drums from the song. Let's make some final tweaks here. Open and a 2 up again. Let's go into the release time. Turn that up a little bit more. Yeah, a little over a second there. Last thing we're going to do, let's turn on the EQ. There is actually a sub bass in the song. If we listen to the reference song, let's go to that section. Or we can go to this first drop here. There is this very simple sub bass. I think it's just a sine wave that's just playing on the offbeats in between the kicks. And so because that's in the track, I think this bass sound, I'm willing to bet they high passed it in some way. So we're going to use our EQ. And we'll just do like a little low shelf thing here with band number 1. We'll just turn that down. And we'll probably bring the frequency up to, I don't know, 80-ish hertz or something like that. Just to kind of leave the subs open for any sort of separate sub bass that we want to add. This is more of like a mid kind of tonal bass, this sound. So let's start from the top here. Let's listen to it with the drum loop. Get a sense of that in the context of the drums from the song. And then we'll listen to the second 16 bar motif here, and then we'll wrap this one up and we'll move on, and we'll add those pads in. So with this sound, yeah, it's really all about that filter cutoff modulation, dialing that in, getting a little bit of the velocity sensitivity here, velocity modulation to the filter envelope to get a bit of dynamic movement on those MIDI notes that we're triggering with a higher velocity. But yeah, it's fairly dry sound, fairly straightforward. It's really there to support, and we're going to hear when we add the chords in how it kind of fills out the low mids to fill the spectrum out and just make the chords and the combination of this bass sound really full and high energy in the mix. So we'll move on to the next video and we'll construct the pads over the bass. Okay, so let's now tackle this pad sound. This is definitely going to be a little bit more involved than the bass, but it should be fun, and we're going to dig into some features in Enna 2 that I think will be pretty cool. So the sound comes in the extended mix, at least. The first time we hear it is right around the 1 minute and 32 second mark, which I think is the first drop of the song, if I remember correctly. So here's a little lead in, and then right there, just hear that one chord. Here's our bass again, and then in the second drop is when it really plays the full chord progression. And with my limited chord figuring out skills and a lot of help from the plugin Scalar 2 from Plugin Boutique, really awesome plugin, highly recommend it. I was able to sort of kind of figure out the chords here. So not to make this too much of an advertisement for this plugin, but it's got this really cool auto detect mode. So I played the song into this as an audio effect. I can place it as an audio effect on an audio track. I turned this detect mode on, and it just kind of detected, it spat out all these different chord and different voicings of chords that it thought it was hearing. And I kind of clicked through and figured out which ones sounded closest to me. And I determined that our chord progression starts with 2 repeats of a B minor going into an F sharp minor 7 over A into an E minor 7. And then in the second 16 bars, we have 2 repeats of the chord progression G major, A major, going into E minor 7. So we land on that E minor 7 as the last chord in both motifs here. So that's what I figured out. That's what I drew in. It sounds pretty close. I don't know if it's exact, but let's go back over here. I have a section where I edited piece of the song that's looping. I actually found a piece of the song where we hear that sub bass, just for reference. So if you want to hear that with the bass that we made in the last video, So if I solo just the section of the track, you can hear that kind of sub bass undulating between the kicks. And then our brassy mid bass sound that we made in the last video. But let's get going on these chords, or on this pad sound, I should say. So we'll add this track. I've got Anna 2. I think I initialized it already. Yes, I did. Let's take a listen to the chords just with the default saw wave. Okay, let's start by finding a different version of a saw wave. We will actually need two saw waves, an oscillator 1 and 2. I landed on the saw modder. I thought that one sounded nice for some reason, so we're going to pick that one. I'm going to copy this over to oscillator 2 because we're going to use two copies of it. Oscillator 2 is actually going to be pitched up by 1 octave, so we're going to get a little more fullness to the sound by having that octave spread. Before we listen to the sound with oscillator 2, though, let me turn oscillator 2's voices down to 0. Let's go to oscillator 1 and let's add some unison voices here. I think I went with about 3. I'm looking at my notes over here. Do about 45% on the D tune, and then we're going to bring the stereo width down to about 54%. So adding a couple voices, detuning them, and just reining them in so they're not panned out too far. We're also going to do a little bit of fine tuning here. I'm just going to detune this by about 9 cents. And we will also go to the filter mix here. We're going to do something different with the filters. I'm actually going to send the oscillator 1 over to filter number 2. We're going to leave the filters in series mode. I'll explain this in a moment here. But let's go over to oscillator number 2 now. Remember, we pitched it up by an octave. This one, we're going to have quite a few more voices. Let's go up to about 7. And you can play around with this if you want to try different voicing amounts. Detune is going to be increased a bit more here. Let's go up to about 65%. And then we'll leave the stereo width all the way up. So this one's reined in a little bit more. This one's just blown out in the stereo field. So it sounds super like ravey, very trancy. We're also going to do a little bit of fine tuning here. We're going to pitch this fine tuning up by 9 cents. And then I'm also going to use the oscillator drift feature. This will randomize the phase position of the waveform every time we hit new notes. So just add a little bit more analog randomness to the sound. This will keep the filter mix on filter number 1. Let's take a look at our oscillator mix here. I think I want to balance these out a little bit. I think I might want to just turn oscillator 2 down a touch and oscillator 1, turn that up a little bit. So if I adjust the volume here, you can see it actually changes here on the oscillator mix window as well. I've got oscillator 1 at like negative 7.9. Yeah, somewhere around there is fine. Let's also loop. Full chord progression here with our bass. Okay, so we also want to add in some noise here, some white noise. So I'm going to use the multi-sampler, one of the multi-sampler oscillators over here. We'll just use multi-sample oscillator 4. If we go to our waveforms here, we're going to pick noise. We just want the white noise. That should be fine. I just saw there's a white noise HP high pass. Well, that's fine. We're going to use this one. And then there's actually a high pass filter built right into the sampler oscillators. So we are going to high pass this one just to cut lows out of it. We just want the top end of it. I'm going to cut up to about 1100 hertz, somewhere around there. Now this is pretty loud. Here, it's every time we sustain those chords, we just have this kind of thing going on. Oh, and I should mention, I don't know if I clicked on this before, but just so you can see the notes in the chords. I mentioned what the chords were, but if you wanted to just pause the video and copy down what the chords are. Again, we have a B minor chord, it's inverted here. F sharp minor 7 over A, also inverted, and then an E minor 7 inverted. And then over here, and that repeats twice in the first 8 bars. Then over here we have G major, inverted as well. We have an A major, also inverted, and then we have an E minor 7 inverted. So yeah, feel free to pause the video, copy those notes in if you want to, but let's get back over to the sound. Open up Anna 2 again here. So the noise, yeah, we don't want the noise to just sustain full on, so we're going to do something a little bit unique here. We're actually going to turn the volume of the noise all the way down. Now bear with me. We still want to use it. We're still going to hear it. But what I'm going to do is use the mod envelope over here to modulate the volume of the noise so it kind of comes in and out. So we'll take the sustain level all the way down here. We are going to keep the release about the same. That should be fine. I want to bring the decay down to about 4 seconds, 4.5 seconds. That should be fine. And then the attack, we're going to bring the attack time up to about 55 milliseconds. Now, to get this modulating, the noise oscillator, what we have to do is bring that to 55 milliseconds first. There we go. What we have to do is we can right-click on the volume control here on the noise sampler, and then we're going to assign this to get modulated by mod envelope 1. Now here we can control the modulation amount or the depth. This is how much. This is controlling the volume of the noise, bringing it in and out based on our ADSR settings here. Now right now it's not doing anything. If I turn the depth all the way up, brings it in and we hear it really loudly, but we just want a little bit of that. Let's adjust our main volume envelope over here as well, which is controlling our other two oscillators. So we're going to bring the release time up quite a bit here. Let's go up to about maybe 2 seconds. So when we let go of the notes, you can hear a little bit of a natural tail to the sound. We're going to drop the sustain level down a bit, maybe like -4 decibels, something like that. And we'll also adjust the decay time. We'll bring that down so it's not super long. We do want it to be kind of long. There's a little bit of a dip in the volume after the initial hit of the notes. And we'll sweep the attack time up as well. So we want the attack to be fast, but we don't want it to hit too hard. The sound is kind of soft and pretty in the reference song. So it's, it doesn't want to hit too hard, but at the same time, it doesn't want to be too slow. So somewhere around that 30 millisecond mark that we had the other volume envelope at, or the mod envelope, I should say, should sound good. You can also change these settings up here. These are just adjusting the curves, like the sloping of the curves of the attack time, the decay time, and the release time. I'll switch this to the ANA 2 setting as well. I'm not sure exactly how all of those adjust the curve, like visually, but just to keep everything uniform, we'll keep these on the ANA 2 setting. Let's do a little bit of velocity modulation again to the volume here. We'll bring this up to roughly 50%. That should be fine. Also, I should mention, if we go back to the MIDI notes really quickly, I do have certain MIDI notes. You'll see the top MIDI note, and particularly the middle MIDI note, I have the highest velocity. The top MIDI note, I have the second highest, sort of like a medium velocity. And the bottom note, I also have kind of like a mid-range, kind of a medium velocity. So really getting that middle note to stand out, I was hearing the F sharp in particular in that first chord just stand out to my ear. So I have that velocity a little bit higher. I did a similar thing over here on the second chord where the A has a nice high velocity. The C sharp is slightly below it, but close to it. And then these two are actually quite a bit lower. The F sharp and the E are down at about 80. So basically the middle note has a nice high velocity. The top note is slightly behind it. And then the bottom notes are going to be a little bit lower than it. And I did that, I think, in both iterations of the chord progression here. So you can see all these velocities are slightly different here. Higher in the middle note and then lower on the bottom note. Just kind of run through these here. And it's the same exact chords over here in the second 4 bars. So we have 89, 99, 80, and 80, just so you can get an idea. So again, this is going to help when we adjust that velocity sensitivity, that velocity modulation amount here. It's going to help certain pitches stand out so they sound a bit louder to our ear. If I turn that up all the way, the effect's going to be a bit too pronounced, so somewhere around 50%, like I said. We're going to do something similar with the filtering as well. Okay, so let's pause for a moment and let's just talk for a second about why I took these two oscillators and sent them to different filters. So what's going on with that? So oscillator 1, we have going to filter 2. Let's set filter 2 up as what I'm going to call our global low-pass filter, meaning it's going to affect all the sounds. You can see that oscillator 4, the sampler oscillator, is going to filter number 1. Oscillator 1 is going to filter number 2. Oscillator 2 is going to filter number 1. Everything eventually is going to go through filter 2 because we have our filter routing in series, meaning the signals, if it's in series, anything that's going to filter 1 will then, after filter 1, go through filter number 2. Essentially what's happening here is oscillator 1 is just ignoring filter 1 and going straight through to filter 2. So we're going to use this to low pass everything. We'll do an LP12 for this one. Now we barely hear anything, right? Let's use the envelope modulation dial here, the envelope modulation amount, to use the filter envelope to modulate the sound. Let's crank this all the way to the top. We'll keep our cutoff all the way down, and I'm going to turn the filter master controls down, the cutoff master control and the resonance. So we get this fast, almost like plucky sound right now. Not quite what we want. So what we're going to do is over here in the filter envelope, we're going to turn the decay time up. This is going to give us a nice fast rise as this parameter here brings the filter cutoff all the way up to the top because we have our filter modulation amount turned all the way up. And then we'll get a slow decay, kind of gradually sweeping the sound down. This is really slow. But it just gives this kind of like falling off effect to the sound. If this is really fast, right, it starts to sound a bit more like a pluck. Slow it down, you kind of hear how it's affecting the sound. So I want this to be pretty slow. Turn the release time up to match it or get close to it. That should be fine. Let's also turn the filter drive up a little. This will distort the signal or overload or increase the volume of the signal going through this filter. Just gives us a little distortion to the sound, a little warmth. Okay, now let's backtrack here to filter number 1. Remember, oscillator 2 and the noise oscillator are both passing into filter number 1 first, right? We have their filter mix set to number 1. Filter number 1 we're going to use as a high pass to remove, just simply, almost like an EQ, to remove lows from the sound. So we'll go to one of the analog filters here. We can just use this high pass 12. That should be fine. We're not going to do any modulation or anything, so we'll leave our envelope dial neutral, and we're just going to set our cutoff to about, where did I have it? About 170, 180 hertz. And this is simply just removing low frequencies from those two oscillators. Remember, oscillator 2 is pitched up an octave, so the lower pitches, the lower notes that we're hearing, we don't really need to hear those overlapping too much onto the notes that are already playing very clearly from oscillator 1, which has the octave pitched at 0, right? So this is just removing some lows from that higher octave oscillator, and it's removing some more lows from the white noise, just thinning those sounds out a little bit and cleaning the sound up. So remember, those are both going to filter number 1. We're in series mode here. Then they pass through filter 2, so they get low passed. So this low pass cutoff modulation is affecting everything. Filter number 1 is just going directly to oscillator number 1. It's going directly to filter 2, and it's bypassing filter number 1. So hopefully that all makes sense. Okay, let's get into our modulation here. We're going to do some modulation with the LFOs because there is this kind of vibrato pitch modulation tape warble effect thing going on. So we're going to use LFO 1 here. We can leave it at a sine wave shape. We're going to leave the tempo syncing and the retriggering off. I do want to slow the rate down to about 2.27 hertz. This means that it's not synced to tempo, but it's just moving at roughly 2.27 cycles per second. So every second, this sine wave is kind of wiggling 2 1/4-ish times through. Okay, it's just kind of cycling through that. And we're going to use this to modulate the fine pitch of everything. So we have 2 different targets, 2 different parameters that we can use, or that we can modulate with this sine wave LFO. We're going to start by doing pitch fine all from this list. Now this is going to sound pretty intense. Let's solo just the sound for a second. Way too much, right? So what we're going to do is reduce this modulation amount here, this dial to the right of the parameter that we selected. I'm going to bring this down to about 40%. Now this works in tandem with this global depth dial, This allows us to control the depth of 2 targets at once. It's a little confusing, I know, bear with me if you're new to this. But we'll just leave this at its default setting. It defaulted to 6.18%. We'll just leave that there. And for all intents and purposes, we are just using this dial to control that pitch modulation amount from that LFO. And we just want to dial that back. So I had it at about 40%. That's fine. We're also going to use this same LFO to modulate the volume of everything, but not so drastically. We're actually going to drop this down to about 20%. So we have this one LFO, this kind of cycling movement. It's controlling the pitch, but it's also controlling the volume a little bit. And we chose all for both of these because it's affecting all of the oscillators and the sampler as well. So hopefully that all makes sense. It's not synced to the tempo, it's just kind of free running. The rate is, I have it at 2.35 hertz. Feel free to play around with this. If you really turn these parameters up, you can hear very fast pitch modulation and volume modulation there. It's kind of slow. When we bring it below 2 hertz, you really start to hear that kind of vapor wavy tone. So yeah, 2.2 something should be fine. And then I'll dial these back to where I had them. 40%, 20%. Okay, and then onto effects and EQ, and then we'll wrap this up because this video is getting a little bit long here. What did I have this at? 20-ish%, that's fine. For the effects, I actually just want to use one effect here. I'm going to use a multi-band limiter because the mid-range gets a little bit loud in this sound, just to kind of keep some of those frequencies under control. Let's make sure we turn it on first. I'm going to bring the threshold down until we start to see some gain reduction. Now it's kind of squashing the mids. I don't want too much of that. We're going to back this off a little. So this is just setting a threshold to catch peaks. So certain mid-range frequencies, when they get loud, this will keep them under control. I want to keep the lows and the highs about where they're at. So we're not really touching those. So you can see it's just kind of gradually pushing down on the mids when they get loud, because there's a lot of mid-range, detuned, saw wave harmonics in this sound. Probably back that off a little more. This is nothing that's going to be super noticeable on the sound, like, oh my god, bro, your multi-band limiter sounds amazing on your pad. It's just something to kind of keep the sound under control. Okay, that's probably fine. It's just there to catch peaks when they do occur, when notes are overlapping and things like that. Yeah, -3, -4. Okay, and then lastly, we'll do a little bit of EQ. And this is really going to just drive the sound home. So the first thing we're going to do is remove lows. We don't really need any low frequencies below, like, I don't know, 120, 130 hertz. Maybe even cut up more than that, but that should be fine. 121 hertz. Then we're going to use a high shelf. We'll use band number 4. And let's hear how that sounds. Let's go to about 2 kilohertz. You can see the frequency down here as I'm moving this dot on the EQ, and we'll boost that. Let's go a little drastic with that, like 6 dB. Here's the gain, 5.5. And then we'll use band number 3 just to give the mids a little boost, maybe somewhere around 900 hertz. 3 dB boost or so. If we A/B with the EQ on and off, start from here, versus with the EQ on. Here, it just brightens up the top a lot. Probably cut a little bit more low out. We'll check our multi-band limiter, which might be working a little harder now. Yeah, it's starting to kick in a little bit more. Maybe we'll back off the threshold just a hair. That sounds pretty good. I'm trying to see if there are any final touches. Looking at my notes here. I think we're in good shape. Let's listen to it in context with our bass, with the drums from the original song. Start from here. The sound is just a little loud overall. Could back off on the EQ settings, but I do like how it's tone shaping the sound, so we'll just go up to the master volume here and just drop that maybe 1 or 2 decibels. We do want to make sure our output is not clipping here, and it looks good. Yeah, that multi-band limiter is kind of keeping the volumes of the different frequencies under control. If we look at our oscillator mix, we can see the various volumes of our different components of the sound. And that's going to do it for the higher pad sound. This sound, since I kind of did this recreation, I've been playing around with the sound, and this is a really fun one, especially if you make trance music or anything like that. It's got just that great classic super saw kind of sound, but there's that nice noise layer to it and everything. So we'll save this preset and we'll include it with the download files for this course. So yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Hope you've learned something about Anna 2 or just about sound design in general. And I will see you all again soon on another Sonic Academy tutorial. Take care, everyone.